Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for November 27th, 2024. Since the election of Donald Trump, in what was a thorough repudiation of the Harris, Biden, Obama team with their commitment to permanent warfare, there's been a flood of material that's been proving exactly what we had to say. First of all, that this faction is committed to defeating any rivals that would threaten their domination of the world. It's escalated its defense of the unipolar order through geopolitical divide and conquer wars that have taken us to the edge of nuclear warfare. Secondly, at the center of the war hawks is the City of London and Wall Street corporate oligarchy, and I'll show you in today's update some of the evidence that's emerging on that. And finally, point number 3, we cannot rest with the electoral defeat of this network. The real work begins now, and I pointed this out yesterday in a discussion of the potential for global economic reconstruction without the constraints imposed by an imperial oligarchy. And I would urge people to think about how the issue is the development of the physical economy of every nation, every sovereign nation on the planet. So let's take a look at what the enemies of mankind are involved in. Can be a subhead, the reckless insanity of global NATO. Let's start with the statements of Robert Bauer, who's a Dutch admiral and the head of NATO's military committee. What he said is that NATO must no longer think of itself as a defensive alliance. He said, quote, "There's a new discussion within NATO, and I'm glad that we have changed our stance on this and on the idea that we are a defensive alliance that will sit and wait to be attacked before responding. It is more prudent not to wait, but to strike Russian launchers if Russia attacks us." He goes on to say it is more competent not to wait, but to hit launchers in Russia. A combination of precision strikes is needed that will disable the systems that are used to attack us, and we must strike first. So he's not saying wait till Russia attacks. He's calling for preemptive strikes into Russia. Now, some observers point out, especially the more sane ones, that Russia has not attacked any of the 32 members of NATO, despite the involvement of NATO in the war to destroy Russia. Secondly, just a footnote here, is Zelensky at the G20. He criticized G20 leaders, the group of 20 leaders, at their summit for a lack of a strong response to Russian provocation. As he always does, the grifter-in-chief had his hand out asking for more, more, more. Now, on this point, the New York Times had an article on November 23rd about the discussion underway of stationing tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And this has come up because Ukraine used to have nuclear weapons when it was part of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, and that they were removed as one of the first steps of the agreement between Gorbachev and the West. The New York Times reports that the Biden administration is considering the possibility of nuclear weapons as an add-on to what they're doing now. They've already planned to add more assistance to Ukraine before Trump comes in. So this is part of the Trump-proof policy of NATO. The New York Times reports $7 billion more in weapons and ammunition from Pentagon stockpiles. That's in the 6 weeks before Trump is inaugurated. An additional $2.1 billion for new weapons from U.S. defense contractors. Now, further, the Pentagon, and according to this article, said that the ban on U.S. military contractors was lifted to help the Ukrainian army fight back against Russia. Now, they're obviously moving fast because of their recognition that Trump will likely oppose further Ukrainian aid as part of his push to bring the war to an end. And so the idea is get as much in there now so that there's no way he can stand in the way of a continued war. In other words, permanent warfare. That's the strategy of the Biden team. Now here's another point. The Daily Express of London reported that France and Britain are discussing sending troops to Ukraine once again, especially if Trump shuts down the Ukraine gravy train. They quote a military source who told Le Monde, quote, discussions are underway between the UK and France on defense cooperation, particularly with a view to creating a hard core of allies in Europe, focused on Ukraine and wider European security. They go on to say that French officials have openly discussed deployment of troops to Ukraine. This is not new. Macron did this months ago, but it's come up again. The current French Foreign Minister Barrot told the BBC on November 23rd that European nations should not set and express red lines regarding their support for Ukraine. In other words, don't rule out sending troops. And when he was asked, are you saying that you would send troops to Ukraine? Monsieur Barrot said, we do not discard any option. And Macron, the president of France, told The Economist, quote, I'm not ruling anything out because we're facing someone who is not ruling anything out, unquote. So this is something that has to be added into the reckless escalation being discussed in the West. Now, the fact that this discussion is real was indicated by a statement from Lord Richards, the previous chief of the defense staff, who is commenting on the discussion about the refusal to rule out such a deployment. What Lord Richards said, quote, I would strongly advise the government not to get involved in any such force. And he went on to say that Russia doesn't want NATO in Ukraine. And this is a red rag that's being put in Putin's face. And he said that we need to accept Russia's view, even though we might not understand it. A rare voice of sanity from the United Kingdom, but he spoke out because this is obviously a plan that's actionable and ready to go. Now, just in terms of the commenting on the panic in the global NATO circles, we have some comments from Scott Ritter yesterday. He said, quote, the Russians have hit us with a unique weapon, the Oreshnik, that we can't shoot down, can't interdict, and when it hits us, it kills us. And they have the ability to assemble dozens of these missiles almost immediately. Ritter went on to say that they have probably, as we speak, from 12 to 25 of these weapons available. That's 12 to 25 locations in Europe that will cease to exist if Russia fires these missiles. Now, Colonel Douglas Macgregor made a similar point. He said the Russians are convinced that the West wants to destroy them. The Russians are being responsible, Macgregor said. It's the Americans who are being reckless, unquote. Now, finally, I'll call your attention to two recent reports from Kit Clarenberg that were put on the Gray Zone site of leaked documents in the UK of an operation called Project Alchemy, which is an operation devised by senior military officials. It was started in February 2022 to stop the peace talks so that Ukraine would keep fighting. The Gray Zone reports that Project Alchemy's stated purpose was to impose strategic dilemmas, costs, and frictions upon Russia. And its goal is to engineer a long, grinding war through covert operations. Now, keep in mind, it was the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who was sent to Kiev to scuttle the peace agreement that was negotiated between Ukraine and Russia within 1 month after the special military operation was launched. So how many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians have died because of the British effort to keep the war going, which is partly reflected in these documents that have been leaked on Project Alchemy. Now, the Gray Zone reports that Project Alchemy outlined every conceivable field of warfare, from cyber attacks to discrete operations to outright terrorism, to carry on the war. And they went on to say that the secret cell even put forward a plan to aggressively pursue and dismantle independent media outlets, such as the Gray Zone, through an aggressive campaign of legal harassment and online censorship, so they would be forced to close. So here we see the documentation of the insanity of the NATO forces in using war to continue to maintain a control of what they call the rules-based order. That is, rules that benefit only the billionaires of the corporate cartels in the West and put the rest of the world on a path toward extinction. Now, this is why we are in an urgent mobilization at the LaRouche organization. And that's why we have this conference on December 7th and 8th. I urge you, use the link in the description section to register for the conference and register as many people as you can. We have to keep this information flowing, and more importantly, the idea that there is an alternative to war, and we should never submit to the so-called power of the unipolar order. Now, tomorrow there'll be no update because it's Thanksgiving, and I wish to give my U.S. colleagues an opportunity to spend time with their family instead of posting the update. But we'll be back Friday. I'll be taking your questions then. And in the meantime, I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving and an opportunity to use the time to reflect on the unique human potential to solve problems using creativity and applying the methods that were developed by Lyndon LaRouche to achieve a new, stable security and development architecture that serves people of all nations. So happy Thanksgiving.